The disheveled and broken man stumbled as he crossed over the threshold of the 8-story apartment building and out into the night. The storm was raging above, the cascading rain blending with the tears streaming from his eyes. But he didn't care. He didn't give a damn that his clothes were drenched within seconds as the aching in his chest consumed his weary thoughts. He thought they had something special. He knew they did. But when she not only turned down his proposal, but laughed as though it was a mockable offense, he felt his wounded heart crumble from the inside out. The streets were vacant, aside from the lone, exhausted traveler, but he was grateful for that. Being after 2 a.m, most homes and businesses alike had already shut off their lights for the night. That, combined with the thunder clapping violently from above, only added to his melancholy state. Having taken a taxi to visit the woman he had held close to his heart for the better part of 2 years, he chose to make the return trip on foot. He didn't feel compelled to rush back to his own lonesome and otherwise empty apartment, nor was he in any mood to make small talk with some random driver. No, he wanted to salt his wounds with the rain, to be alone with his thoughts without having to glare at his drab, blank walls. Even if it would take 2 to 3 hours on foot to reach his home, it didn't matter to him at the time. He just wanted the pain to stop. He just wanted to hold her again. Simon Earl Brock had always considered himself to be quite strong. He went to the gym almost every day after his shift ended, had since he graduated high school some 16 years ago, but his physical fitness made this burden no easier to carry. He always made sure to maintain his outward appearance, his short, dark hair styled to perfection, his beard trimmed but soft, quite pleasing to the eye of any potential love interest who may catch his pale green eyes. His brand-name clothing was pricey enough, but not abundantly so. Brock was a man more focused on his appearance than his vehicle or living arrangements. But none of that mattered to him at this moment. As much as he craved the comfort of his apartment, all he wished was to distract his weary mind from this most recent assault on his fragile emotions. After 40 minutes or so, his tears having lessened substantially, lessened but not halted, Simon began to take note of his aching feet. Was it his anguish or his stubbornness that led him out on this seemingly endless stroll? He wondered as he stopped for a moment, shielding himself from the rain under a department store awning. Chuckling slightly while attempting to ignore the burning in his chest, he pulled the phone from his soggy pocket, finally set on summoning a ride. Exhaling an exhausted sigh, feeling all the more defeated than he already did, he momentarily considered launching the soaking wet and unresponsive device into the road. As he reared back, set to do that very thing, his trembling arm reminded him of how truly tired he had grown, how weary both his body and mind had become. With another heavy exhale, he slipped the hopefully not completely deceased phone back into its moistened confinement, preparing to get back on the lengthy trek. That was, until something caught his eye. Though it wasn't exactly uncommon for others to be walking the sidewalks at this time of night, the sight of the shadowed form off in the distance struck Mr. Brock with an unexpected sensation of fear. The silhouette would only reveal itself when the regular lightning illuminated the night sky, but even as far off as it was, the clumping footsteps sounded only yards away. Filled with a sudden and almost blinding sensation of terror, he sprinted back out into the storm, his feet rapidly splashing across the sidewalk. With every hastened footfall splattering his already drenched pants with near freezing salt water, those behind him matched his pace. With that, the knowledge that the lone stranger accompanying him on his journey across the city streets was indeed in pursuit, he knew that his only chance was to locate both shelter and protection. Simon had never been much of a fighter, save for a handful of moments in which violence was seen as the only option. But he was certain that he could not hold his own against some potentially armed assailant, not with how winded he already felt. In an attempt to rationalize the rapid steps matching his own, he patted down his pockets as he continued to flee. Perhaps he had simply dropped his wallet or keys, the one behind only seeking to return them to their owner. But as he located the bulge of each of his few possessions he had brought along with him, he couldn't argue against the bitter truth. Someone was chasing him, not to aid in his travels, but to very possibly put an end to them, to leave him broken and bloody upon the rain-soaked pavement, his bodily fluids blending with the water streaming from above. Darting his eyes to each door and every darkened window alongside him, he felt his desperation increase with the sight of only vacant shops and eateries, which had likely locked up hours before. Tears ran down his face as the rain washed them upon his dripping wet shirt, the thunder booming overhead, only heightening the hopelessness of his circumstances. With the clomping shoes of his pursuer sounding only feet from his back, he chanced a single glance over his shoulder, letting out a trembling breath with the sight of the silhouetted form still as distant as when he had first noticed it. He fought to ignore the splitting in his side and the wheezing of his lungs as he plundered onward. His back was aching, his feet were soggy and agonizing, and his hope was wanting, even with him managing to keep his lead for the time being. He knew he could not keep this up much longer, not with the shivering of his extremities growing all the more erratic with every pound of his soles against the concrete. It was as the fragment of remaining hope began to leak to the ground beneath his feet, as he readied to resign himself to whatever fate this stranger had in store for him, when he noticed the soft illumination ahead. At first, he thought it may be nothing more than the sporadic street lamps casting some sort of mirage against an otherwise closed-down storefront that caused the near haunting glow across the concrete. But as he drew closer, the foggy glass window on either side of the entrance came into view, each with a warm, amber lighting behind them. Without a second thought, Simon practically burst through the thankfully unlocked entrance the moment he closed the gap. Slamming his back against the wooden door after it closed behind him, his eyes firmly shut as he gasped for breath. He hadn't taken the time to take in his new location, and he didn't really care. All that mattered to the shivering man, as the warmth of the place began to caress his numb extremities, was that he had found sanctuary. It wasn't until those hastened footfalls, which had been in pursuit, drew closer to the only building open for business in the area, that he blinked his eyes back open. "Help me," he whimpered to the lone individual behind the bar of the apparent tavern he had entered. "He's after me." The slender man behind the counter gestured with a tilt of his head, beckoning the terrified man to approach. "Take a seat," he said in what sounded to the still trembling Simon to be an English accent. "But he'll see me. You need to hide me, please," the terrified man begged as he approached the bar. "Nah, he won't," the bartender said with a wink and a click of the tongue. "Trust me." The slender man in the dark gray, pinstriped vest and white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, gestured to the window next to the wooden door. As the hesitant Mr. Brock reluctantly cut his gaze to the outside world beyond the small tavern, he heard those hastened footsteps drawing near, as though there were no borders blocking the path between them. When a silhouetted form passed by the glass, highlighted by another stab of lightning, his would-be pursuer showed no hesitation as he drifted by. Within seconds, the shadowed individual was out of view. When the ambient stomping of the heavy feet distanced all the more, until the only sounds beyond the room he now occupied were those of the storm, Simon allowed a shaky but relieved sigh to escape his lips. "Would you, care for a drink?" the ponytailed bartender asked, inspiring a light chuckle from his guest. "Yeah, that would be lovely," Simon said, the tension in his neck and back easing, as he took a stool before the bar. I could definitely use a beer." "Any preference?" the well-dressed man asked. "Whatever you have on tap will be fantastic," Simon said with a strange smile reaching across his face. As the slender man pulled a glass from behind the counter, tipping it to the tap before him, Brock took a glance around the small tavern. Having visited many such businesses over his years, he was something of a connoisseur. While this one was far more, intimate than he was used to, only 4 round tables and 7 stools in front of the counter, he found the ambience quite inviting. The dim lighting and blissful aroma of the many types of beverages combined to form such a strangely welcoming sensation. There were only 3 doors in the place, the one through which he had entered, another behind the bar, likely leading to an office or storage area, and 1 door at the rear of the building. Simon giggled a little at the sight of an antique payphone mounted to the wall, right next to the back door, idly rubbing his pocket in search of change. He allowed himself a satisfied smirk as his fingers jingled with the tune of moistened coins. Once he allowed his still somewhat shaken state to dissipate with the aid of a chilled pint or 3, he felt assured that he could utilize this forgotten relic of the past to summon a ride back to his apartment, that his long walk had finally come to a close. "Does that still work?" he asked, as the bartender slid his fresh beer across the counter. "Not in the way you may be hoping," the man said with a sneaky half-smile. "Shit," Simon sighed. "But," the ponytailed stranger said, "you can use this one whenever you're ready." He gestured to the rotary phone on the far left of the bar. As Simon cut his gaze to another forgotten relic, he felt his lips separate when his eyes met the faded, lime-green plastic device. Not only had he not seen such a thing for more years than he could even say, but it was identical to the one which used to rest on the side table in his childhood home, a house he had not had reason to visit for almost 2 decades. "Maybe I'll just dry off for a bit," Simon said, his hand shaking a little more as he raised the chilled glass to his lips. "How late are you open?" "For as long as it takes," the bartender said with a smile. "I've never been a strict schedule type." "For as long as it takes?" Simon said, finally turning his gaze from the retro device at the end of the bar to the surprisingly kind, yet somewhat mischievous eyes of the man behind the bar. "For you to make your way to where you're headed, of course." Brock, having always had a knack for being able to suss out what's going on behind the glare of those with whom he spoke, outside of those times in which strong emotions were involved, he could not figure out the true intent of the well-dressed man, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something the stranger wasn't telling him, like a secret he was dying to share but wouldn't. "So," the bartender said, clearly attempting to shift the topic at hand, "what brings you out into the world on such a night?" As the eyes of the ponytailed man lightened to one attempting to make nothing more than friendly small talk, Simon allowed himself to relax again. Just a bartender doing his thing, he thought, having shared many such empty conversations through the years. I just needed to be alone, I suppose. It's been an emotional day. Ah, the bartender said, nodding his head. So what's her name? That obvious, huh? I suspect that just about any bartender can recognize the expression of a wounded heart. The man reached beneath the bar, lifting a small metallic ashtray to set upon the countertop. Care for a smoke? He asked, pulling a pack of cigarettes and a somewhat tarnished silver lighter from his pocket. I can't even remember the last time I was able to light up in a bar, or anywhere for that matter, Simon said with a chuckle. My bar, the ponytailed stranger said as he lit up his own smoke. My rules. I don't mind if I do, Brock said with another chuckle, running the cigarette beneath his nostrils after slipping it from the splayed open pack. Help yourself, the man said, setting the pack on the counter next to the ashtray. So, do you want to talk about it? Well, Simon did want to talk, perhaps needed to. He was not one to discuss the things which brought him pain. He didn't have many friends, often spending the majority of his time away from work alone, but even to those few with whom he felt somewhat comfortable, he would rarely share his personal affairs. In this case, however, he not only felt compelled to share his story with the stranger, but he wanted to. Whether it was due to the fact that he had never laid eyes on this man before, and likely wouldn't again, or simply that his most recent wound, carved into the fabric of his heart, was so crippling that he needed to share it with someone, he couldn't say. Rachel. Rachel is her name. And what happened between you and Rachel? The bartender asked, sitting upon the stool behind the counter, pouring himself a draft. I proposed, and she wasn't interested. Is that right? The man behind the counter said, sipping from his glass. That is a shame indeed. How long were the two of you, together? Huh? Simon said, caught off guard for a moment, having mentally drifted away as he considered his circumstances. 2 years. 2 years last week, actually. After that long together, I would imagine you knew her quite well, yes? Of course. I thought I did, anyway. So, from your, I imagine, countless interactions, did she give you any reason to assume she was ready to marry? That she wished to marry you? Brock was growing steadily more uncomfortable. Something about the way the bartender's gaze seemed to peer right through his, as though digging around in his thoughts left him more uneased by the second. I thought I was good to her, you know. I treated her right, like a princess. I thought that she loved you as much as you loved her. I knew from the minute we met, you know. I knew that we were right for each other, that we were meant to be together. And did she feel the same? Simon cut his eyes from the stranger, glancing back to the storm beyond these walls. Can I use that phone now? He asked, his back stiffening from what was beginning to feel more like an interrogation than friendly banter. You never discussed the prospect of marriage? Over your time together, 2 years, yes? Did the two of you talk about such commitments? I mean, like I told her from the start, you know? Told her I wanted to settle down, that I already knew that she... I should really get going. Can I? From the start? You were already talking about marriage from the beginning? It's a wonder that such a thing didn't, scare her off. I mean, not like from the start, you know? Early on, yeah, but how early on? Look, man, I gotta get home, you get me? It's late, and what's the rush? The bartender said, his expression still friendly and kind. Only a little while ago, you were ready to walk all the way back to your apartment, yes? I mean, I was, but I gotta work tomorrow, you know? I wasn't thinking straight after your messy breakup? Yeah, that's right. I wasn't thinking straight, you know? Simon was growing restless upon the stool he had claimed. Had he informed the bartender of his destination? Did he say anything about his inspiration to brave the storm, to wash away his misery after he left her place? Why was he being so pushy about this? His thoughts were in chaos, not only from the events which led him to this downtown tavern, but from this bizarre inquisition. Go ahead, the bartender said, gesturing to the phone with a tilt of the head. Thanks. The stranger shifted his attention back to his own pint as Simon paced to the end of the bar, pulling the phone from its perch. As he held it to his ear, he realized that he had no idea which number to call. Once more, slipping his own device from his still damp pocket, hopeful that he may be able to at least pull up the information of the taxi service he used to reach the home of his love, he exhaled another shaky breath when there was still no life reflected upon the blackened glass of the screen. "Do you, you got a phone book?" Simon asked with a nervous chuckle, apprehensive about pulling the bartender's attention back to him. With another nod, the man behind the counter gestured to the sheet of paper pinned to the wall, containing the information of a variety of transportation services. "Oh, thanks, man." His back now twitching slightly from the combination of his moistened clothes, dropping his body temperature considerably, and his growing unease with the company he shared, he drifted a finger across the sheet mounted to the wall. Selecting the first number on the list, a taxi service named Scratch & Sons, he made quick work of dialing the number. His fingers trembling as he fumbled with the antique device, his mind flashing back to his childhood home once more. Snapping back to the here and now, once a friendly voice replied from the receiver, his aching heart skipped a little. Thanks again," Simon said after his brief discussion with the taxi service, pulling a damp $20 bill from his wallet and tossing it onto the counter before heading to the door. "Wouldn't you rather wait inside?" the bartender said with a smile. "It's raining like hell out there." Nah, man. I don't want to miss it, you know. They said they're just a few minutes out. Thanks, though." Brock pushed through the door, neither glancing back to the man behind the bar, nor even considering the shadowed figure who chased him to this tavern in the first place. All he knew was that everything within him was begging to leave this damned pub. "Another time, perhaps," the ponytailed stranger said in a light but dismissive voice. Yeah," Simon muttered as the door swung shut behind him. "Sure thing." Even with his back pressed to the wooden door, the awning above blocking most of the rain from reaching his shivering frame, he still felt the eyes of the unsettling bartender upon him. Wishing to be as far away from this man as he could, while not risking missing his cab, he casually strolled past the window to the closed-down store to the left of the bar. As the minutes trickled by, each second dragging to multiple times its normal length, Simon continued to dart his eyes from one side to the other. Not only were the roads absent of any late-night travelers, but the bar he abandoned remained the only source of light, illuminating the flooding tarmac. Whether it was nothing more than his paranoia that inspired him to feel like he was being watched, or simply the bizarre conversation with the bartender, Brock was growing far more unsettled with each passing moment. When another violent stab of lightning inspired the lone pedestrian to jump, two sights greeted his eyes at once as he turned his head from one side to the other. The first was the approaching headlights, rounding the corner a good half a block to his left. The second, which caused his heart rate to quicken with such haste that he instantly felt his head growing light, was the silhouette to his right, speeding across the sidewalk toward him. Without taking the time to consider his actions, the near crippling fear almost paralyzing his extremities, he took off running to the best of his ability. Each harried step felt only slightly more confident than the last as he waved his arms, screaming out at the top of his lungs. He couldn't know if the incoming headlights belonged to the ride he had requested back at the bar, but he could only hope that were it some random commuter rather than his taxi, they would take pity on him and offer him an olive branch. Again, the footfalls sounded as though they were only inches from his back, at most, but he wouldn't let up. His side was screaming, while every labored length of his flat-out sprint felt like the last he could accomplish. But as the vehicle drew close enough for him to make out the yellowed paint job of the hood, illuminated by the rectangular lights guiding its path, Simon practically leaped into the middle of the road. "Stop!" he screamed out, bracing himself for either the impact with the car or the outstretched arms of his pursuer. As the tires screeched to a halt, the driver of the cab battling with the steering wheel to regulate the brief moment of hydroplaning. Simon almost fell to the pavement in his attempts to avoid a collision, while he could hear the angered mutterings echoing from the helm of the taxi. He would worry about the explanation when he was safely in the back seat. "I'm so sorry," he said, still gasping for breath as he yanked the rear door ajar, throwing himself into the seat. The driver, a heavy-set, balding man with a patchy gray and black beard and a stained plaid button-up shirt, just glared from the front seat.
"Are you Brock?"
he said, his voice more of a growl than anything friendly or inviting. "Yeah, I'm sorry, man," Simon repeated. "I saw you approaching and figured I'd try to meet you halfway." Feeling no desire to explain to this already clearly agitated man his true motivations for being so eager to get into the cab, he hoped that this would be a sufficient enough reasoning.
"Almost got your fool self killed,"
the driver grumbled, adjusting his posture back to the road ahead.
"No one would have blamed me if I nailed your ass neither."
Again, I'm sorry, man. Sir."
"Where to?"
his chauffeur asked, exhaling a heavy and exhausted-sounding breath. As Simon turned his attention back to the world beyond the doors of this musty-scented and somewhat filthy vehicle, he could see no other signs of life reflected in the bright headlights. 49 Bailey Avenue, the Winmar Apartments." Without another word, the driver threw his shifter into gear, hitting the gas so hard that the wheels spun in place for some seconds before catching the drenched tarmac. Even with the all-too-obvious irritation of the man behind the wheel, along with the borderline whiplash inspired by the jerky takeoff, Simon felt the tension in his back and neck ease for the first time since leaving the home of his would-be fiancée. Before he knew it, Brock felt his eyelids growing heavy in that smelly and quite uncomfortable back seat, his body's exhaustion and mental drainage over the day having taken its toll. With the familiar landscape of the open road passing by at a hastened rate through the window, he allowed his senses to give in to the impending darkness.
"Hey!"
A clearly angered voice bellowed, snapping Simon back to the waking world.
"That's $27, and you better toss in a damn good tip for dragging me out in this shit."
While he muttered more than spoke those closing words of his demand, the drowsy man in the back thought it best to heed his request. "Is cash okay?"
"Yep,"
the driver grunted, gazing through the rear view. I'm sorry again," Brock said, holding out the 2 drenched 20s. Everything got soaked, you know." The driver whipped the bills from his client's fingers, still not looking back, folding them and slipping them into the pocket of his shirt. "Yeah, keep the change, I guess," Simon muttered as he pushed open the rear passenger side door. Finding himself standing on the sidewalk just outside his apartment complex, Brock took a moment to just breathe in the night air. The storm had let off considerably, barely a drizzle now, though the thunder still rumbled from above. As the taxi screeched its tires once more, the driver seemingly planting the pedal to the floor again, Simon dug into his pockets in search of his cigarettes. Feeling more relaxed than he had in hours by this point, he suddenly needed something to distract his mind from the building melancholy, the memories of his last conversation with the woman he loves echoing from the recesses of his mind. Naturally, as his fingers gripped onto the moistened cardboard, he saw no reason to inspect the likely unusable cigarettes within. With a heavy and somewhat defeated sigh, he glared from his apartment building to the 24-hour gas station on the street corner up ahead. Finding his craving outweighing his desire to re-enter his lonely apartment, Brock decided that one last short stroll wouldn't hurt. He was still soaked from head to toe. He was still exhausted, both physically and mentally, but a fresh pack of smokes was something he could control, something within his power, within his reach. It only took minutes to reach the convenience store, and only moments to retrieve his reward for his final jaunt of the night. Smacking the pack on his outstretched hand as he began his short trek back to his home, tearing the plastic wrapper and tossing it to the sidewalk with his head in the clouds, his muscle memory took care of lighting his smoke. With a deep inhale, inspiring a brief but satisfying sensation of euphoria to his still clouded mind, he stopped in place for a time, halfway between the gas station and his hopes for a much-needed shower. As he stood there, just gazing up into the night sky, he allowed the subtlest of smiles to cross his lips, almost inspired to chuckle at the night's bizarre events. It was at that moment, with one hand in his damp pocket and the other guiding his smoke to his waiting lips, when a familiar sound inspired that brief relaxation to come to a screeching halt. The second those quickened footfalls reached his ears, he spun in place, the cigarette dangling from his lower lip like a panting puppy's tongue. Even with the bright lights of the gas station, the rapidly approaching figure still appeared as nothing more than a shadow made flesh. On top of that, it looked as though this thing was bringing the storm with it, the cascading rain surrounding it like a dismal blanket across its very own reality. Simon let out a high-pitched squeal, which would have sounded barely human to anyone who may have heard it, as he took off on another desperate sprint for his life. He didn't look back. He couldn't look back. All he knew was that he must reach his home only feet ahead. As he closed that small gap, whipping his still dripping keys from his pocket, he could barely control his violently trembling fingers as he begged them to unlock the door. With those footsteps growing louder by the second, accompanied by a strange and unsettling tremor as the storm approached, he finally slipped the key into the lock. The second he threw the door ajar, Simon threw himself over the threshold, slamming it shut behind him. Again, he wouldn't look back, even when the doorknob jiggled, as someone battled to enter behind him. He wasted no time in darting towards the stairway, well aware that awaiting the elevator would only drive him closer to the brink of madness. With his heart racing more wildly than it had before, Brock shot up the steps, taking two at a time in an effort to reach the safety of his apartment before the stranger could potentially break through the front door. 5 floors worth of steps later, Simon was sprinting across the hallway in search of the entrance to his home. Again, his attempts to unlock his door were no simple task, with the shivering rendering his hands almost useless. But when he did manage to make contact, he stumbled to the floor of his living room, kicking the door shut behind him. After clambering back to his feet, he snapped the deadbolt shut, running to his dining room to grab one of the wooden chairs. He propped it against the door, just under its knob for good measure, and just gazed at the door as he backed away from it, as though it held him at gunpoint. He had no landline to call for help, nor was his cell phone currently functional. All he could do was hope that his relentless stalker would not be able to make his way into the building. All he could do was wait. Time passed by in a muted blur as Simon stood, paralyzed in his living room, just glaring at his front door. He didn't look at the clock mounted to the wall, nor did he strip himself of his drenched clothing. He just stood there, begging for some semblance of assurance that he had indeed escaped, that he was safe. After a while, maybe an hour, or so it felt to his disconnected mindset, Brock hesitantly approached the window, looking down onto the sidewalk from which he had fled. Seeing no trace of any silhouetted figures, or anyone else for that matter, he finally allowed himself to feel secure in the knowledge that his pursuer may have given up his chase for the night. The damp clothing fell with a splat to the tiled floor of his bathroom, the warm water spraying from the showerhead, a most inviting sound. It felt almost silly to him as he stood beneath the artificial heated rain, how relieving the sensation of more water embracing his aching body felt. The dry clothing he donned after drying himself off felt all the more heavenly than the steamy shower in returning natural blood flow to his extremities. Yes, he still couldn't shake that feeling of being on guard, nor the fear he was attempting not to register deep in the recesses of his mind. But at this moment, he just wanted to rest his weary bones. As he climbed into his bed, the mattress already caressing his tense frame to the point of near relaxation, he felt suddenly parched in the most potent way. Smacking his lips as he flipped on the television, waging an inner argument on whether or not to get back to his feet to head to the kitchen for a chilled beverage, he just wanted nothing more than to fall asleep. Allowing himself to surrender to the comfort of his pillow, halfway gazing at the TV with his eyelids barely keeping themselves parted, his consciousness once more faded into the black. His rest, unfortunately for him, would be short-lived when the hacking cough thrust his mind back to awareness. He sat straight up, his oxygen restricted to the point in which he could almost feel fingers tightening around his throat. Falling to the floor, he clutched at his neck, wheezing in between gasps. Buckled over on his knees, slowly but steadily regulating his breathing, he gripped the mattress, lifting himself back to his feet. His eyes burned from the sleep being so violently interrupted, almost as much as his throat, as he took a deep and strained breath. Standing in place, he knew he should have taken that reluctant walk to the kitchen before giving in to slumber, a thought which almost forced a chuckle past his lips as he creaked open his bedroom door. "Water," he whispered aloud, his burning throat allowing no more volume than that. "Let's grab some water and back to bed." Having lived in this apartment for some 4 years or so, he had little trouble navigating his way to the kitchen, with his eyelids barely cracked. Snatching a bottle of water from the second shelf of his decade-old refrigerator, the very same shelf upon which he had kept such beverages stored since long before he moved out this way, he unscrewed the lid, chugging down the entire bottle as though this was the first drink taken after weeks lost to the desert. After tossing the drained bottle in the trash can next to the fridge, he grabbed a second to keep by his bedside, before making his way to the bathroom one last time for the night. He was still in a daze as he headed back to his bedroom, his senses muted and muffled while he pushed through the door. He did not recall closing back shut. Whether it was a slight shift in temperature as he paced into the room, the almost intoxicating scent filling his nostrils, or the dramatic shift in the lighting that struck him first, he would not register at the time, but it wasn't until the familiar, yet friendly voice met his ears that his weary eyes truly sprung wide open again. "All right, Gov," the well-dressed man standing beside the counter of the pleasant street-side bar said. Simon could offer no words, nor any rational thoughts as he stood perplexed in the open entryway of the small tavern. His reeling thoughts seeking any explanation for this, he whipped his body around, set to speed back into the short hallway between his bedroom and bathroom. This would be a destination he could not reach, of course, a fact that he could barely even begin to comprehend as he gazed out into the vacant road with the rain cascading to the pavement before his eyes. What? He stuttered, his chaotic thoughts unable to process this sudden relocation. "Fancy another pint?" the man to his back said, his tone both gentle and stern in a strange sort of way. Simon reluctantly turned back to face the dark eyes of the stranger, noticing a haunting mischievousness behind his gaze he was certain was not present at their last meeting. "Have a seat, yeah?" the stranger said, gesturing to the bar stools with a nod. "You look like you need to sit down." With his rational thoughts crippled by surroundings in which he had planned to never visit again, his mouth twitching and his entire body trembling, Brock just paced forward. His mind felt vacant from his shivering shell as he lifted himself onto the same stool he had occupied some hours before. The bartender poured a fresh draft, just as he had the last time, though his stare did not break from the man before him for a second. Even as he slid the chilled glass across the counter, his intense gaze did not falter, nor did that of the lone patron of this otherwise empty tavern. He didn't ask how this mysterious ponytailed man had manifested his small pub in place of what was once a cozy yet cluttered bedroom only moments before. He didn't ask why he found himself glaring into those dark and far less friendly eyes for the second time that night. Somewhere deep inside the dissipating storm in the back of his mind, contrary to the one still soiling the earth beyond the walls of the bar, Simon knew exactly why he ended up here. Not only that, but he was growing more aware by the moment that the man before him was no simple bartender. "So," the barkeep said, pouring himself a drink, "tell me about Rachel." Simon just glared back at the man, who appeared to have grown significantly paler since their last meeting. Not only did his flesh seem almost devoid of any color now, but his frame looked thinner, near skeletal in its proportions, yet muscled and lean. He did not want to talk to this man, nor share his company in the slightest. It would seem, however, that he had little choice in this matter, given this alarming shift in location from one room to the other, many miles away. I love her. Unrequited, I assume. Yes? The well-dressed gent would not shift his gaze from that of the trembling man on the other side of the counter. His eyes were not accusatory or malicious, only pensive and cold. While his voice maintained its friendly tone, there was no inviting warmth behind it. No, she loves me too. I know she does. She just... Don't even try that, Gov. You may still be attempting to fool yourself, the bartender said, still softly but free of emotion. But you cannot fool me. Far more talented liars have tried. The two just glared at one another, the only sounds resonating through the small tavern being the still constant beating of heavy raindrops against the exterior walls and windows. Simon could feel the eyes of the stranger digging deeply behind his faltering gaze while he fought to maintain eye contact. Though it was beginning to feel like a childish staring match between kindergartners, he felt compelled to battle for some semblance of dominance. Of course, while the cold expression on the face of the strangely intimidating bartender across from him did not shift in the slightest, Brock could not keep his own from twitching the longer this went on. Finally, understanding that he hadn't a hope of winning this infantile game, Simon cut his eyes down to the glass of chilled ale, lifting it from the bar and practically inhaling half of its contents in one gulp. He did not look back to meet the eyes of the man behind the counter, not until he began to speak again. "I'll tell you what." Brock instantly lifted his gaze to the still emotionless man. "How about we get back to Rachel later, yeah?" Simon barely reacted, still considering the fact he would not be escaping this interrogation. But the change of subject, he hoped, may allow him to veer the conversation in a different direction, one which may allow him to return to the comfort of his bed and the safety of his apartment. "Let's go back a little further." Brock tilted his head, his expression inadvertently drifting to something more confused than afraid. "Tell me about... Caroline." "What? How?" Simon only managed to squeak out that lone, stuttered word before the full realization of his circumstances struck him like a wrecking ball through an already crumbling wall. "Your first love, yes?" the bartender asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "And how did that turn out?" She led me on," Simon said softly, his eyes beginning to well up. She knew how I felt about her. She teased me, made fun of me, mocked me in front of everyone." "She was what, 16? "Well, so was I," Brock said, pounding his fists on the counter. I wasn't... I'm not a fucking freak." "Is that right?" Again, they just glared at one another, Simon's face crimson with rage, and the bartender still a pensive statue. That's a tough age, Gov. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one to defend bullying by any means. But sometimes we make mistakes in our youth. She made me look like I didn't live down the stuff she said for... High school was hell. It was hard, difficult for me. And that justifies it? What happened next between the two of you? I was angry, humiliated. I just wanted to even the score, you know? It's not my fault that she took her own life. Any further words caught in Simon's throat, the understanding that he could neither lie to this man nor himself, claiming his ability to speak. They laughed at you, so you tormented her for 6 months? 6 straight months of stalking, threats, and anonymous, despicable gifts? That's how you even the score from a moment of humiliation? I never expected her to... Brock's words had reduced to barely a whisper as the shame and guilt combined with the hateful gaze of the barkeep chewed into the eyes he would not raise from his glass. Was anything she said, the words which humiliated you so much, were any of those false? The subtle shake of Simon's head was unnecessary, as the bartender knew all too well the truth of things, but he was somewhat surprised and very slightly impressed that he admitted to it. And how did you feel when you heard? That morning, during the announcement from your homeroom teacher, Mrs. Angela Mills, yes? How did that make you feel when you heard that Caroline had slit her wrists in the bathtub the night you left a mutilated rat under her pillow? Brock kept his gaze fixed on the glass, barely reacting to these questions. It wasn't guilt, was it? You didn't feel ashamed of your actions in the slightest, did you? Another, much more subtle shake of the head. But you felt something, yes? Something to which your fellow classmates would attribute to sadness, yes? A subtle nod. You were afraid that you would get caught. Terrified that you would be blamed, as you should have been. Tears fell from the eyes fixed to the glass perched upon the bar. He didn't whimper. He made no sounds at all. His glassy eyes wept into his beer and onto the counter. Of course, not unlike the first life he had inspired to end, this was not out of guilt or shame, but the fear of what may lie ahead for him. I wonder, the bartender said, once more pulling out his pack of cigarettes, fishing one out, and dropping the box to the countertop. Had she not disposed of your gift before she took her own life? Had she held on to any of the other grotesque presents or threatening letters, would you have been prosecuted for her death? A stuttered whine breached the lips of the trembling man as he still refused to raise his eyes to meet his inquisitor. The system doesn't always work out the way it should. In this case, though, had you been locked away all those years ago, perhaps more lives could have been saved. The bartender nudged the open pack of cigarettes toward the shivering man as he lit his own smoke, tossing the lighter beside the pack once he was done. Help yourself, Gov. We're only getting started, after all. Why? Why are you doing this to me? Simon said, finally raising his tear-drenched eyes to meet those of the bartender, slamming his fists upon the counter again. The ponytailed man simply replied with a wink and the click of his tongue, gesturing to the pack of cigarettes with a nod. Brock could barely command his fingers to obey his will, as he attempted to slip one of the filters from the pack. "I got you, Gov," the bartender said, slipping one out and holding the butt to his customer. Simon pinched the filter between his lips, his shivering fingers still tapping on the bar. The well-dressed man cupped one hand around the lighter, the flame igniting the tip of the cigarette, trembling in the mouth of his patron. With one deep inhale, Brock managed to control his shuddering hands a little more, gripping the cigarette between his forefinger and thumb to sip from his cold brew. Thank you, he stuttered, still attempting to avoid making eye contact with the bartender after his hopeless outburst. Jennifer came next, yes? The well-dressed man said, sitting upon the stool behind the bar, taking a drag on his own smoke and tapping it against the rim of the ashtray. How did you meet her? Please, just let me go. I won't, I'll stop. Just tell me about Jennifer. She was an accident. I never meant to push her from that bridge. You accidentally nudged her off a 50-foot drop over the railing? It wasn't like that. Simon got to his feet, again slamming his fist to the solid wood of the counter. You chased her. She fled. You caught up to her. You shook her by the shoulders, pressing her back to the railing. You're simplifying. That's not entirely. You pushed her. Over and over again, slamming her lower back against that rail. She wouldn't listen. I just wanted to talk. I needed her to hear me out. She wouldn't. Harder and harder with every push. The bartender slapped his palms upon the bar with every word, his spiteful gaze growing more sinister with every strike. It's not like that. I was shaking her, but I didn't. Over and over. Harder and harder. Every word was still enunciated with another slam against the bar, each growing significantly louder and more powerful than the last. She screamed with every push, every single time. You slammed her against the rail. Stop! With every push, every strike, she cried out, louder and louder, harder and harder. For God's sake, stop! Until the bartender's voice suddenly returned to a soft and gentle tone, relenting his assault on his own countertop, as Simon could almost not make out a word over the ringing in his ears. Until she pushed back, desperate to break free. Brock had no memory of when he got up to his own feet, as his gelatinous extremities shuddered against each other. But he stood there, facing the still hateful expression, hearing his words echoing directly into his ears. She was in so much pain, the bruising you had left upon her aching back, almost dropping her to the ground. She was scared, so very scared of what you would do next. Simon began to back away, slowly at first, but he knew he had to find a way to escape. She thrust a knee into your pitiful little sack, didn't she? Her screams turned to spiteful laughter when you buckled and whimpered. The lights within the small tavern began to flicker as the flesh of its owner grew paler, with dark, pulsing veins reflected through the surface. That laughter, he continued, his voice now echoing, though not in volume, but an eerie sort of intensity reverberating against the now shuddering walls, sending your fragile little mind back to Caroline. Simon reached the door, his shuddering fingers attempting to grip around its knob. So you pushed her with all your might and hatred, didn't you? Brock snatched his fingers around the doorknob, instantly throwing his exit open. He rushed out, back into the storm, his bare feet slapping against the flooding tarmac. But we haven't even got to Rachel yet, the haunting voice called out, seemingly from every building around Simon as he darted across the road. The eerie and piercing laughter which erupted from each business he passed, their doors flying open and windows shattering, with that howling sound breaching every one, almost inspired the fleeing man to fall to his knees, retching upon the road, but with the intensity of his current fear tripling what he had felt only hours before. He knew he could not give in to his swimming head and churning gut. Glass rained across the pavement, both behind and before Simon, his screams elevating with every shard tearing into his soles as they pushed across the sidewalk. He still wouldn't stop, ignoring the agony and his weakening limbs as much as he could, while plundering on in search of a reprieve. "Think you can outrun me, Gov?" the bartender said, now leaning against the wall of one of the buildings to Simon's left, still casually exhaling nicotine from his false lungs. "Maybe if you run a little faster, yeah?" Brock only hesitated momentarily as the shock of seeing the ponytailed stranger almost turned his already quivering legs to useless, limp noodles, but still he would not yield in his efforts to escape, as pointless as it was beginning to feel. He knew that this man was unlike anyone he had encountered before that night. He had no doubt, deep in the recesses of his mind, he refused to acknowledge that there would be no escaping from this monster dressed in human flesh and bone. But this attempt to flee was something within his power, something he could control. While every woman with whom he had attempted to connect through the years could clearly see beneath the mask he wore, he still took control of those situations. He still had the final word, even if it would amount to a little more than a grotesque perversion of a bitter farewell. He had to know that he could control the outcome of this bizarre night, whether that would be a failed attempt to convince himself, or a revelation of defeat. In the twisted and mutated mind of Simon Brock, this was his only option: to outrun the devil himself, rather than allow his sinister game to play out. In the forefront of his disgusting, deranged, and tormented brain, the fleeing man saw himself as the hero of this story. Naturally, deep in the backroom of that grotesque grapefruit, he knew who the true monster was in this equation. Whether or not he could outrun that fact, of course, was not something he was prepared to question. "Keep going," the ponytailed stranger said, as Simon drifted past him for the second time. "You can make it, right?" Brock howled a scream, layered in both panic and anguish in equal measures, the strength in his violently trembling limbs giving out more by the second. Again, that haunting chuckle called out from all around him, though no doors flew open this time. No shattering windows rained more obstacles across the pavement. "Catherine was next, yeah?" the ponytailed man said, nonchalantly as the terrified man hobbled by him again. "Then Jess. You remember Jess, right?"
"Leave me alone!"
He still wouldn't stop, spanning the next 2 blocks ahead, darting down a slender alleyway the second it came into view. The path appeared to stretch further than he could see, a much longer distance than he would have estimated, given the dimensions of the shops on either side. But he didn't question this. Slowing his agonizing sprint to a jog as his surroundings grew darker, he took both reluctant and hesitant steps onward. With his arms outstretched before him, feeling as a blind man making his way through unfamiliar terrain, a sudden and unexpected glimmer of hope awakened within him when his fingers brushed against something familiar. Though the large metallic dumpster reeked with week-old garbage, almost flipping his guts upside down, Simon grew inspired by an idea. Maybe he could not escape the one who can so casually appear out of the blue ahead of him, but to hide from him, perhaps? Darting his eyes from one side to the other, as he gently lifted the lid of the waste receptacle, making out little more than darkness in either direction. Though he couldn't rely on sight, the sounds had been pursuing him just as relentlessly as the man himself. Thunder growled from above, as it had for the entirety of his journey. Obese droplets of rain beat against the concrete and the bricks on either side, as well as the metal of the dumpster itself. But that was all. No voices jeering at him from a distance. No footsteps of approaching silhouettes. No haunting chuckles reverberating against the walls. Breathing through his mouth, blocking the sense of smell to the best of his ability, the trembling man lifted himself into the dumpster. The hinges of the plastic lid began to squeal as he lowered it above his head, inspiring him to steady his movements all the more. This darkness was far more intense than that of the slender alleyway, but he was alone. He would not shift his position, even when the thought of the bacteria and filth concealing him, eating into the torn flesh of his soles, attempted to distract him from his mission. He could go on through an intense course of antibiotics later, once he had freed himself from this place. He could seek comfort another time, stretching his legs with no confinement, restricting his movements. For the time being, though, he had to be still. He had to be quiet. He could not risk discovery, no matter what. As the minutes swelled to 10 times the regular length, Brock grew far more aware of his discomfort. He felt every lump and each discarded article pressing against him as he fought to remain still. Losing himself in his thoughts for a moment, he inhaled through his nostrils, immediately finding to hold back the gagging and bubbling of his gut. Just a little while longer, he thought, wincing from the lingering, pungent scent after closing entry to his nostrils once more. So, he waited. He just lay upon this disgusting waste, attempting to allow his thoughts to drift away in search of greener and less revolting pastures. Time faded to a blur as unexpected slumber took hold of the desperate man, his consciousness falling into the black and away from this nightmare. Whether it was that stomach-churning odor, or the tiny teeth nibbling on his fingers and toes that jerked his mind back to the waking world, Simon would remain uncertain. Whatever the case, being both fully unaware of how long these potentially diseased rodents had been munching on his flesh, and still mentally vacant from being awakened in such a manner, Brock threw open the flap above his head, regardless of the possible consequences. "Whew! You stink," a friendly yet mocking voice spoke, the second the rain began to spill across the not-so-well-hidden man. "Nice try, though. Can't run anymore, so might as well hide. Yeah?" The well-dressed man was leaning against the wall parallel to the dumpster, which now had a very perplexed man sprouting from its top. The two gazed upon one another again, one wearing a slightly mischievous smirk, and the other taking his bodily spasms to the next level. "You ready to talk, or you wanna—" Stumbling as he fought to free himself from the foul-smelling waste, Brock was not yet prepared to endure any further questions. "Yep," the bartender said with a heavy sigh as his quarry sped back up the way he had come some time ago. "That's what I thought." Placing his hands behind his back, the ponytailed man strolled gingerly up the darkened alley, not breaking his gaze from the fleeing man until he darted around the corner. "You're a bloody persistent wanker, aren't you?" he said with a fairly exhausted chuckle. Simon decided to just keep running straight forward this time. No turns, no efforts to hide, and no looking back. He had driven past this very street many times over the months of making his way to Rachel's place. He knew this road almost as well as each step which led to her third-floor apartment. There was a time, back before he cursed this damn street and every mocking storefront, when he actually enjoyed the sights on either side of him. Now, however, Mr. Brock feared that if he had to endure this seemingly endless maze any longer, that he may lose what little shred of sanity he had left. No matter what, how far he must run, or how much he had to push his already burning limbs, he would not relent. Yes, he knew that this mysterious bartender knew everything. On top of that, deep down in places he was not ready to register, Simon knew he could not truly escape whatever fate the man had in store for him. But that didn't mean he would give up. Even with his side splitting in a manner that would suggest his entire torso may tear itself in two at any moment, he kept plundering onward. No more lefts or rights, only the path ahead. It felt like hours since he had last seen the ponytailed stranger. When he saw the parting of the buildings ahead, with only the open road behind them, hope finally inspired him to push his weakened extremities harder than he had yet. With a jubilant howl, as though he was the first to cross the finish line of the Boston Marathon, Simon threw his fists to the air when he passed by the last row of shops and eateries to find the storm did not extend past the main strip. Be it from the sheer exhaustion or the semblance of relief, the air seemed almost cleaner to his senses when only trees stood on either side of him. Taking a hesitant glance to his rear, Brock felt his jaw separate at the sight of what he could only describe as a wall of rain encasing the city street, like a bizarre snow globe. I did it, he stuttered, his chest still heaving, but for a different reason. I beat you, you son of a bitch! Cackling like a madman, resuming his course away from the mysterious tavern, he transformed his harrowing escape to a leisurely walk. His robe and pajamas were soaked through, and his feet still oozed fluids to the dry pavement beneath them. But as he wandered on, Simon considered that he had never felt so exhilarated. For maybe 10 minutes or so, he strolled on without a care in the world. Even when signs of life beyond his own revealed themselves in the distance, he didn't give a second thought to the fact that he had escaped. Regardless of the fact that he had somehow been transported to that damned bar after leaving his bathroom behind, he still believed he could outrun his own sins. Whether it was the vision of that same city street ahead, as the familiar buildings, darkened sky, and wall of rain came into view, or the distant footfalls from behind him that caused his heart to practically leap from his chest, he would have no time to consider. But as he whipped around to see that shadowed form gaining more by the second, he was so stunned that he couldn't so much as command the scream to leave his slack jaw. Without wasting time considering the lesser of the evil ahead and the one behind, he darted straight for the woods to his right. For the briefest of moments he did consider aiming for the left, but with him plundering across the right side of the road, it was simply a matter of which tree line was closer at the time. Twigs, rocks, and many more shapes and sizes of forest debris dug into the already shredded soles of the panicking man as he weaved in between and around the trees. But that didn't stop him. He could hear those harried footfalls still clapping across the concrete as though they were right behind him, but he knew that had to be his mind messing with him. There was no road in the woods, of course, something which allowed him to entertain the idea that this truly was all in his head. It still wouldn't stop him, though. The combined soundtrack of the distant thunder and much closer feet would not allow him to even slow for a second. Burying himself deeper and deeper into the darkened forest until his ankle twisted around a thick and jagged root which could have sprouted out of the ground right before him for all he knew. Before he had the time to register what was happening, Simon found his limbs flailing wildly as his body beat against the bumpy ground down the steep incline. Finally coming to a stop, his numerous fresh wounds screaming almost as much as his ruined feet, Mr. Brock found his consciousness wavering. His head light and his senses faltering, he once more allowed himself to fall into the darkness which surrounded his shivering frame. Tiffany whispered into his ear, his eyes twitching back to life. She was a sweet girl, Guff, a disembodied voice said, as though the trees themselves uttered the words. Oh, he whimpered, his mind still feeling disconnected from his broken body. Scampering back to his feet, his head both groggy and loopy, the voice seemed to echo from all around him.
Sandra, Eliza, Denise, do you remember them?
No more!
They remember you.
Please stop! Simon whimpered as he limped across the dried leaves, brushing away the stretched branches from before him.
You cannot run from your sins, child.
What was once a somewhat gentle and calm English accent called out, his pitch far deeper and more haunting.
Face me and prepare for judgment.
Pushing aside the brush, his heart beating violently against his sternum while the echoing words moaned into his burning ears, Simon finally broke through the trees. The road ahead was not as vacant as he would have hoped, of course. Whether or not he had craved the sight of another human being, anyone other than the smug face of the tormenting bartender, That did not make the sight of the row of pedestrians any easier for him to stomach. They didn't mock him, point fingers, or accuse him in any way. Even the ghostly form of his first love, glaring at him with empty, blank, and lifeless eyes. Even she showed no hatred in her gaze. Only the resolve of finally facing the one who drove her to carve into her own flesh, to end her torment in life. Simon just stood there, glaring at the corpses of each life he had snuffed out, whether by his own hands or his actions. His eyes shedding a river upon his already drenched robe and the rain pelting him from above. He didn't even react to the approaching footfalls. He knew that his time had come, that he must face the one who knew of his sins long before he fled into the small street-side tavern. Turning to face the shadowed form as it came into view, allowing one last heavy sigh to pass his lips, he prepared himself for what was to come. The silhouette slowed, only feet from where the shivering man stood, the ghosts of his sins fading from his periphery. Pacing closer, the streetlights flickered, unveiling the face which had been hidden from him throughout his journey through the hell of his own making. You can deny, rationalize, and bargain all you like, his own voice sneered as the all-too-familiar face came into view. But you can't hide the truth from me. As his mirror image gestured to the side with a tilt of his head, Simon followed his gaze to the source of the light, his violently trembling legs guiding him closer to his already decided fate. He and his doppelganger reached out to the door, their hands blending into one as they pushed through. "So," the bartender said, his elbows propped on the counter before him. "Tell me about Rachel." Blood trickled to the hardwood floor through the torn strips of fabric and flesh lining Brock's arms, legs, face, and torso. The soundtrack of the storm to his back, beyond the open door to the bar, fell into a muted hum as he limped forward. The bartender lit another cigarette, offering over the pack once more, just as he had upon their last meeting. With another chilled ale awaiting him as he took his place at the counter, Simon allowed a defeated chuckle to escape his lips. "You can't blame a guy for trying," he said, lifting his glass as if to say, "Cheers." "I wouldn't have expected any less," the well-dressed man said, not so much as offering a smile. "We met at the gym some years back, Rachel and I. We texted back and forth for about a week before she agreed to let me take her out. She liked me, you know. Yeah, I was nervous, like I always get with someone new. She just giggled at my insecurities. Found it cute, I think." "How'd that first date go?" "It went, yeah, not so good. I got too eager, you know. It had been a while since Denise." "Yeah, yeah, Denise. It had been a couple of years since her, so with how well things had gone over texting Rachel, I loved her already, you know? It wasn't love. You know that, right? Infatuation, perhaps. In your case, though, I would think obsession is more accurate." "No," Simon said, pounding his fist on the bar yet again. I love her. Why couldn't she see that? We were meant to be. It was obvious to me, but she..." "Do you really believe that, Gov? Can you not see how twisted that actually is? Hey, fuck you, man. You don't." With a simple flick of the bartender's wrist, Brock's mouth slammed itself shut. He attempted to squeak words through the cracks, but even pulling at his lower jaw with his trembling fingers, he couldn't hope to form another word. I do know, Mr. Brock," the ponytailed man said, his intense gaze drilling through the quivering eyes of his customer. "I see you for exactly what you are." Simon tried to get to his feet again, to make one final attempt to escape, but things would not go how he hoped this time. Granted, his previous efforts had proven quite pointless, but he still felt like he had some semblance of control over his fate. And not this time, though. This time, he would hear what his inquisitor had to say. This time, there would be no outrunning his judgment. "Since you can clearly see no reason," the barkeep said, lighting another cigarette, while his customer still made a desperate attempt to free himself from the bar stool, "allow me to tell you about what happened between you and Rachel. After you prematurely introduced her to the real you at that pleasant little restaurant only a few blocks from this very tavern, she kindly asked you to take her home, at which point you grew defensive, yes? You begged her for a second chance over the short drive back to her home. You pleaded for her to grant you entry, but she locked you out the second she crossed the threshold. Over the following weeks, you would not yield your efforts to reach out to her, eventually inspiring her to change a phone number that she had used for the better part of a decade. You followed her. You stalked her. You would not leave her behind, no matter how much she begged. Months bled to years. You knew enough about her to know that she could not so easily move away on a whim. Even if she could, your constant harassing phone calls to every job she tried to work left her on the brink of destitution. Yes, she called the authorities, but you've been playing this game for long enough to know how to not leave enough evidence to convict. Yes? Then, after years of tormenting this poor woman, you broke into her home. You awaited her arrival to make your pitiful proposition. She was afraid. She was bloody terrified of you by this point, but she wouldn't give you what you wanted. She would not show you any weakness. She laughed in your face, mocked you in the way you should be mocked, you disgusting, pathetic, cretinous bag of filth. Silence fell across the small tavern, with not even the storm providing a backdrop to the spiteful gaze between the two strangers. Simon felt his lips separate as control was returned to its owner, but he had no words to offer. I didn't mean to hurt her, Brock whimpered, cutting his eyes back to the countertop. I just got so angry. She laughed at me, mocked me like I was some kind of freak. When she pulled out her phone, I wasn't thinking straight. My hands, they seemed to grab her throat on their own. They squeezed, and I couldn't stop it. I didn't mean to. For what it's worth, you didn't. What? Everything that happened tonight, you breaking into her apartment, the brief conversation between the two of you, even you accidentally choking the life from her, she experienced none of it. But I can't give back the lives you took before you met Rachel. But I was able to, intervene before you took this one too far. Simon just glared, slack-jawed at the arrogant smirk on the bartender's face. She will awaken tomorrow, not only with no memories of you, aside from a quite uncomfortable date some years ago, but she will also receive a phone call from a previous employer, the first job of which you robbed her. Her old position has since been filled, of course, but they want her back badly enough to offer her a new role at twice her prior earnings. So I didn't, I didn't, hurt her? Oh, you did, Gov. You murdered her with your own 2 hands after years of torment. She simply wasn't present for this particular event. But it comes to this, Simon Earl Brock, the bartender said, his skin growing pale again, the blackened veins pulsing beneath the flesh. His hair poured across his shoulders, hanging before his face with the shimmering orange glow now beaming from his eyes, flickering through. Twisting his neck from one side to the other, stretching open his jaw to reveal multiple rows of jagged and uneven teeth. Thick and foul-smelling drool leaked from his gaping maw to the floor as his posture grew hunched and hauntingly feral. With those eerily illuminated eyes peering through the violently trembling skull of the man before him, he swiped a slender arm to his right, peeling open reality beside him, leaving a perfectly rectangular door-shaped hole leading from that small room to somewhere not found on any map. The choice is simple, the now monstrous, contorted husk of a man said, his voice unchanged but for its echo. Turn yourself into the authorities, not only admitting to every crime you have committed, but providing them with indisputable evidence. Simon ran for where the entrance to this tavern once lay, finding only another wall. He pounded against the wood, wailing, begging for help. Help which would not come for him. Or, come with me. Begin your torment now, rather than awaiting your execution. Brock fell to his knees, pleading for forgiveness for his crimes. But that too would not come. As he gazed up, consumed by the absolute horrors hidden behind the flickering, flame-like eyes glaring back at him, whether due to his fracturing mind, crippled beneath the reflection of his own despicable sins, or perhaps his inner surrender to his forthcoming atonement, the result would be the same. Being unable to utter a single word, as all ability to reason poured across the floor in an endless river of tears, Simon Earl Brock had no need to speak his decision. Somewhere, far deeper than he could ever begin to register, almost as though he'd only recently been reacquainted with some semblance of reason, he knew his final destination, whether spending time behind bars or not. The storm fell still behind the boundaries of the small street-side tavern. The city fell silent once more. While the surrounding buildings had closed up for the night some hours before, the only business still operating at this hour finally dimmed its lights. With the day's workload having reached its conclusion, the well-dressed, ponytailed bartender began cleaning up the small tavern for the night. Mr. Brock would never be seen again, neither on this street, nor anywhere else upon this mortal plane. But he had arrived at his destination, after all. Was that really necessary? A voice asked from behind the veil of darkness, now encompassing the small tavern. No more so than his own actions, the bartender replied, not looking up from wiping down the counter. Still, a little over the top, don't you think? He was a monster. I only showed him what it was like to be a victim. If you were just going to send him to the pit anyway, why? I gave him a choice. You showed him 2 doors, maybe, but you practically pushed him through the one that you picked. What business is this of yours, exactly? The well-dressed man said, finally raising his eyes to meet those of his new guest. Well, the man said, stepping from the shadows. Father said you had changed. I just wanted to see for myself. Not everyone is frozen in the past, mate. Oh, I'm not frozen. But I know what you are. And that will never change. The 2 men just stared upon one another, the one behind the bar wearing an unfazed, yet mischievous smirk, The one before him, with his hands in his pockets, glaring in more of a pensive and condescending look. "One of these days," the man just outside the shadows, now making his way to the exit, said, "you'll prove me right. That you are still the same hateful, spiteful, and bitter child I grew alongside." He glanced back over his shoulder, his back still facing the bartender. "You'll show everyone that you belong in that damned pit. You may be Father's favorite pet. But deep down, in places he is not ready to admit, he knows what you are, just as much as I do." "Always nice to see you, Gabriel," the ponytailed man said, resuming his wipe down of the countertop. "One way or another," Gabriel said, pushing open the door, allowing the night breeze to drift through the otherwise vacant bar. "Everyone will see who you truly are. What you truly are. Even Michael." With that, he faded from view as quickly as the door swung shut behind him. The bartender, having completed his duties for the night, strolled to the back of the small, darkened tavern, slipping the receiver from the payphone by the rear door. Punching in a series of numbers before hanging up the archaic device, he swung open the door to his left. "Bloody wanker," he said, shaking his head as he walked out into the flickering orange glow, which lay both behind this bar and the world we know.